Hello there everyone, and welcome to this master class series on basic sewing. I am Jedi Amanda and I sew a lot of cosplays. This video will contain lots of awesome information on how to build your own sewing kit and get started with a sewing machine for anybody who's wanting to get into cosplay or even just learn how to sew. First, we'll start out with how to build your own basic sewing kit, and then we will move on to learning how to start sewing on a sewing machine. So let's first build our own hand sewing kit. Now, everybody's hand sewing box, hand sewing kit is a little different. These are the tools that I think you need for your absolute minimum of a hand sewing kit. Now, most people use the sewing machine for the majority of sewing outfits, garments, pretty much anything. But you will notice that there will be some spots in garment making and especially cosplay making that it's kind of hard to get under a sewing machine, and you'll probably need to hand tack it down or do a basting stitch or even finish a hem of like a dress with hand sewing. So I'll show you what I have in my hand sewing kit. Now, the first thing you'll need is a box to keep everything in. Having all of your hand sewing stuff just strung around up in your sewing area or your crafting area is not going to be the best option for you. So especially when you hand sew, it's really fun to kind of take your stuff away from your crafting area. I like to do that. I like to go and just kind of like binge watch shows while I'm hand sewing. So it's really nice to have a box to have everything in. First thing you will need is kind of the obvious: needles. A variety of needles. Now, in cosplay, you'll be sewing through all kinds of different fabrics, not just cotton. So I highly suggest you get different gauges of needles, different sharp edges of needles. I actually love leather needles to sew through a lot of really, really thick costumes because it is like a triangle shape at the tip of the needle, so it can go through a lot of different fabrics at one go without having to really push it through. So even these upholstery curved needles come in handy sometimes. Now, along with the needles, you'll definitely need some thread, obviously, in whatever color you would like to use. And I suggest beeswax or sewing wax. You can get this anywhere at any kind of crafting supplies along with the hand sewing needles. And what this does is actually strengthens your thread that you are running through your garment. It also helps prevent not knotting up so much, which is really annoying when you're working with a really long strand of thread and hand sewing it. Added bonus point, if you want to really get this stuff to work for you, is you can iron your hand sewing thread after you have run your thread through this a couple times, and it makes it super, super stiff, and I guarantee it's not going to knot up on you when you're hand sewing. I love beeswax. It's something that I really recommend everybody to have in their box. I also recommend everybody to have a thimble. A thimble is definitely optional. If you didn't kind of learn to use one starting out sewing, it's kind of hard to get the muscle memory into using a thimble, but there's a lot of different thimbles out there and they can really help. So I actually never not use my thimble. I always have my thimble on my middle finger, and it's an open top thimble, which means I can feel the fabric a little bit more. I recommend these for everybody's hand sewing box to start using thimbles because you will save the pain of your poor fingers trying to sew through leather. I promise a thimble is well worth it. Whichever finger you want to wear it on is up to you. I recommend the middle one. A pair of snips. Scissors are really, really, really handy in all sewing, obviously, but a small pair of snips, like a 5-inch pair of scissors, or even like the actual thread snips, are really smart just to have in your box. Don't take them out of your box. Don't use them anywhere else. Keep them in your box because I guarantee you're going to need them, obviously, to cut your thread. And the last thing I want to recommend is a 6-inch ruler. This is a flimsy plastic one that I have, but I find these really, really handy to have in my sewing box because you'll never know when you need to like measure something or have a straight edge, or even just have tossing an extra thing of chalk in your sewing machine or your sewing kit is actually really handy. But a 6-inch ruler will kind of help you keep everything in line, keep everything nice and measured. Highly recommend. Not sure if I talked about this, but a pin cushion you'll need to keep your needles in, because having just the needles in the little packages that they gave you is kind of annoying. I like having them in the little classic tomato pin cushion. And bonus fact, this little strawberry that's hanging off the edge of the tomato is actually a sharpening tool. Most of them are filled with emery emery particles or maybe like some kind of sanding particle, to where you can stick the needle kind of in the strawberry, weirdly, and sharpen the edge of your needle so your needles don't go bad so fast. Now, anybody, when you sew, you're going to be cutting fabric, whether it's with a rotary cutter or scissors. I highly recommend you have a self-healing mat, especially if you're using a rotary cutter when you are cutting your fabric. This thing is absolutely fantastic. When you cut on it, it actually self-heals itself. It pops it back up, and it's really, really helpful for when you are cutting large things of fabric and with patterns. Highly recommend a self-healing mat. And along with that, I recommend a rotary cutter. Everybody doesn't have to use one of these. Sometimes they have a little bit of a learning curve with them. Most people just like to cut using regular scissors, and that's totally cool. I love rotary cutters. It's basically a circular blade that you can run along your self-healing mat to cut the fabric out so much faster than you can with scissors. Promise me, if you're really wanting to get into like massive sewing and you want to start with a lot of different garments, a rotary cutter and a self-healing mat will save you so much time. One of the last things I'll definitely recommend is a variety of different rulers. Now, you might ask, you just, use a really kind of basic 12-inch ruler for whatever you're using, but I highly suggest getting some rulers with a seam allowance edge that are see-through and that are in very different sizes, because you'll be using this as a straight edge and also a measuring tool. Also, getting some in different types of units of measure is really, really handy, because you can sometimes buy patterns in the metric system, so they'll have centimeters and meters, and you can also buy patterns in the US inch system. So having a variety of different rulers is extremely handy for sewing and cutting and basically your entire garment making process. Okay, so we have lightly gone over the basic tools that you will want to have. Not every one of these is absolutely you need, but I will tell you, the more you sew, the more your toolkit grows. So these are definitely great basic ones to start out. So now let's go over to the sewing machine, and I'll kind of walk you through how a sewing machine works, the basic knowledge of how to make it go, and we'll even sew a little bit on fabric. All right, welcome to my sewing machine area. This is my Bernina B380, and it's actually a pretty basic machine with a little bit of computerized mechanisms in there. Now, one of the things I tell people when they're starting to sew, especially with a sewing machine, is that you really don't need the crazy fancy sewing machines that are out there. I promise, with garment making, you pretty much just need a straight stitch, a zigzag stitch, a buttonhole stitch, maybe even a blind hem stitch, up to you. But you really just need a basic machine. And the best part is that basic machines aren't too intimidating. Now, even though this one's a computer and it's a fabulous Bernina, it's not that intimidating. So let's get a little closer and I'll show you kind of the things you need to know about a sewing machine when you first turn it on. Okay, we are here at my sewing machine, and the first thing you want to do is turn it on. One of the most sewing machines, their on button is off to the side to the back. Now, important things to note with the sewing machine is that a sewing machine is basically a top thread and a bottom thread that is located in a bobbin. Now, a sewing machine, basically all it does is that you slide your fabric through and it makes interlocking loops that puts your seam or whatever you're sewing on your fabric together. Now, the most important thing to realize is that all machines are a little different. There are top loaders, there are bottom loaders, but for this one, it is a bottom loader. Now, if I can get my bobbin and its casing back in, that's awesome. Okay, sewing machine's made up of a top thread and a bottom thread, a needle, and all the different crazy mechanisms that are inside. Now, when you get a sewing machine, one of the first things you're going to do is to go over the manual. All sewing machines come with a manual, and within that manual is everything you need to know. So before I even kind of go over the gist of things first, read your manual. Within each sewing machine is a special way how to thread your machine. My machine has actually directions on the machine to show me how to thread the top, and is a front loader bobbin case, so I know how to load the bobbin in that way. And all you need to do is, once you have your thread completely all good and through the needle and everything and all the little bars that you have to do, is to choose your stitch over here or wherever your stitch is located on your machine. Make sure you have chosen your width that you need. If you're doing a zigzag stitch, if you're doing a regular running stitch, it's just your length. And within all sewing machines, there is a width and a length option. Just understand that those are two things you need to kind of monitor where you're at and how you're doing it as you're sewing. Okay, so now your top thread and your bottom thread is loaded, your bobbin's in the casing all nice and clean. You're gonna want to lift the foot. This is the foot of a sewing machine and this is the ankle of the sewing machine. Both of those can come off and pop off, so you can change different machine feet and different ankles for your machine depending on what you're doing. That's more advanced for a sewing machine than I have the time for right now, so basically you just need the standard one that comes with the machine. You'll want to make sure that your thread is where it is, and the top thread is under the foot and the bottom thread is up through the plate of the machine, ready to go. I always like to keep it off to the side right here and hold on to it a little bit, because when you first start your stitch, the threads will kind of come back at you a little bit. So put the foot down with the lever in the back. I like to start with my needle down into the fabric by using the turnstile on the right of the sewing machine to put the needle. Always move it towards you, never move it away from you. Once that needle is down in there, I tap on the foot of the sewing machine, the pedal of the sewing machine that's underneath my sewing machine here, and start going. And the more pressure you put on your foot on the pedal, the faster your machine will go. You never want to pull on the fabric or push it through. There are certain feed dogs within the sewing machine that will pull the fabric through as you are going. So you can kind of be hands-free, but not too much. You kind of want to guide it on while you're going. So as I'm continuing making this straight stitch, I can go much, much faster. I can go much, much slower. It's all up to you. And that is the basics of starting your first stitch on a sewing machine. All right, so you've done your first stitch on the sewing machine. The next thing you want to do is to pull the needle out of the fabric. Most machines will kind of bounce back by itself, so the needle's not in the fabric, but sometimes you'll need to use the turnstile on the side of the sewing machine to pull it out. So once that needle is out, lift your foot, slide your fabric off to the left, and cut your fabric. Now you've sewn your first stitch. Now a couple things to remember with the sewing machine. I'll wrap this up quickly here because we don't have too much time, but there are several different types of sewing machine needles for several different types of fabric out there. If you are working with spandex or any kind of super stretchy material, you'll want to use like a ballpoint or a stretch needle. If you're working with leather, there are leather needles out there. So the more you start working with your sewing machine, the more you'll understand the machine itself and what it needs. And one of the things I like to tell everybody is always to unplug your machine when you are done. Not just turn it off, but actually unplug the machine. Sometimes you never know what kind of current might go through your house. Something could damage the machine, or you could accidentally step on the pedal and the needle and plate will slam down and it could damage your machine. So it's important to turn off and unplug. Now, one of the things that you'll need to keep in mind when you have a machine is the upkeep. Machines require oil. They are metal going against metal, so you're going to have to oil your machine every so often. Refer to your manual on how to oil your machine properly, because there are ways to do it improperly. But listen to your machine. If your machine is sounding kind of bad, there might be something not kind of up with that. So you might need to take it to a specialist or refer back to your manual to see what kind of sounds my machine's making. Something might be up. All right, that's all we have time for today for the basic sewing toolkit and basic machine startup for this video. Thank you so much for joining me on watching this masterclass on basic sewing. Make sure to look for part 2 of this series when I tell you how to start using patterns, especially store-bought patterns, because those can be complicated at times. So I'll see you in the next video.